Thank you, Father Jolly. Welcome everyone to this talk presented by the Wojtyla Institute. I see a lot of new faces tonight. For those of y'all who haven't been to a Wojtyla Institute talk before, we're a group that was started some 10 odd years ago by Anna and Greg Polly, grounded in the legacy, to unpack the legacy of St. John Paul II, Karol Wojtyla.
There we go.
We have some correct pronunciation here. But to unpack, his conviction that faith and reason are the two wings by which the soul ascends to truth. So tonight we are going to be hearing from Szymon and Ethan about the legacy and John Paul II's impact in Poland and beyond, and the countries under the Iron Curtain. I wanted to read a little bit of this quotation from a book, Live Not by Lies, which is Rod Dreher's book about comparing our world today to these countries in Eastern Europe under communism. And this is kind of our idea that with the Wojtyla Institute, to gather together to discuss what is true. So the quote reads, "Only in solidarity with others can we find the spiritual and communal strength to resist. The longer we remain isolated in a period of liberty, the harder it will be to find one another in a time of persecution. We must see in our brothers and sisters not a burden of obligation, but the blessing of our own freedom from loneliness, suspicion, and defeat." So tonight, meet some new people, talk about what you hear from this talk, and really enjoy and learn and cherish these fruits of John Paul II and his legacy.
So, my name is Ethan Ferguson. I am the president of Cinelope LLC in town, and I am a software developer. So, I'm not a historian, although I did teach high school for 5 years, so I welcome the opportunity to come back. And basically, I always like to start off my presentations, not really, with a baby picture of me. I know, I was terrified, because this is my great-grandfather, Leon Bosek. He, to put it delicately, was one of the leading communist officials in the 8th largest city in Poland, Bydgoszcz, and he worked for the KGB. So, quite a legacy to live up to. I knew what was going on in that picture. I looked terrified. He had perhaps one of the more interesting stories that kind of embody what Poland was going through after World War II. After being enslaved by the Nazis, he found himself in a rehumanization camp with Holocaust survivors in the Netherlands, where he and his wife were given a choice: come to the United States and become Americans as refugees, or come back to Poland, to a destroyed state where 1/6 of the population of Poland was wiped out by the Nazis. They chose to come back to see what remnants of their family were still there. And when they got there were almost no jobs available. My great-grandfather was approached by the communists, the Soviets who invaded, and he was given a job in the party. And essentially, he rose up through the party ranks to the point where he was basically the mayor of our town in that area. He was also an economics professor at the local university, where he worked primarily as an authority on central planning and the command economy that led to so much suffering in Poland. So this is kind of where I'm coming from, as far as I'm not a history teacher, but there's an important story here that we would like to tell. Because fundamentally, this isn't just random history out there. This is your history. And now I'd like to introduce my speaking partner, Simon, or Szymon.
Yeah, so let's move to my story, which is different, of course. My name is Szymon, or Szymon Duda. The same the last name is the same for our president, Andrzej Duda. And I'm a PhD student from Poland. I came here because I got a Fulbright scholarship. I'm working on my PhD here for 5 months. So I'm doing research in plastic materials. I'm going to deliver the formula that will assess the life of the object made from these materials. Why? Because to prevent any disaster and to increase the safety of operation. So I'm going to graduate this year in September or October in my country, in Wrocław actually. And in the meantime, of course, I will start my work or my job at Academia in Poland, at the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering. That's my second time here in the States. I was here 5 years ago. I used to work as a lifeguard in Virginia. That was a summer job. I really enjoy it. And after that, I travel a bit, mostly in the west coast of the United States. About my ethnicity, so I was born in this area, which is called Orange area, which is called Silesia. It's a part of Poland. But my grandparents, actually my entire family was born there. And they were born in 20s. In 20s, this area was a part of Germany. So they were Germans, but of course in February 1945, they became the Polish citizens. So of course after World War II, it was difficult time there because people didn't speak Polish, right? Because the borders changed and they were not able. So the government very often victimized people there, and they couldn't actually speak German, for instance, at the schools. And then in 70s, my parents were born, so they do remember the 80s, the movement of solidarity, but they were not involved. Basically, what I think, the movement here was not as strong as it was at the north part of Poland. Why? Because there are no really huge factories who gather people together. There are just small businesses. That's what I think. And I was born in 1995. So to point out, my family was not really involved in any movement, but of course they were also not members of Communist Party. We can move on.
So, what is communism? I'll take a hand or two. All right, right there. Jack, hit us up.
Okay, well, I think it is a central planned economy and a very authoritarian government.
There we go. You get the 2 main points. Smart man there. So essentially, communism, according to Winston Churchill, is the equal sharing of misery. And the idea is that fundamentally comes from a good place. In many places in the world, we live in a second golden age, gilded age now, where people wanted more economic freedom. Keep this in mind. Many workers in factories, they wanted better working conditions. They wanted to be able to collectively bargain. They wanted to do all of these things that helped get their individual rights. But at the same time, they sold their soul to this notion of collectivism that goes contrary to human nature, primarily because it sees religion and God as a threat. So throughout all of communism throughout the world, a global institution was fighting God. We are the Catholic Church. We are also a global institution for the promulgation and the put forth of the notion of Jesus Christ and God. So this sets the stage for a battleground around the entire world for the way that communism and Catholicism interacted.
So since we know what does it mean, we would like to answer the question, how do communists keep power actually? And we put some terms that are associated with this question. At the beginning, the falsehood and controlling media. Of course, when you control the media, it's quite easy to manipulate people. And there is, I read several days ago about Russia and Belarus. So, for instance, they are working on their own internet network. So it means that they are trying to control the informations, right? And get rid of the reliable source of information for the people there. Then the starvation and violence. I'll be talking about it on the next slides by giving you an example from 30s and actually 40s. And the last one, surveillance and blackmailing. So we'll be speaking
Yes.
about KGB.
So one commonality throughout all of these communist governments in Eastern Europe, in the killing fields of Cambodia, is that they had a police service, the secret police. They go by many names, the SPED, the Chikov, the Milica. In many ways, they do the same thing. As you see right here, here's the logo for the Cheka, the GPU, the OGPU, the NKVD, the KGB, the FSK, and now the modern FSB. The FSB is currently the security service for the Russians, as their CIA. But, as you can see, that throughout time, they barely even changed the logo. Is that fundamentally, throughout this entire phase, the KGB in Russia, what my great-grandfather helped through this, essentially.
And they changed the name, but they still operate on the same way, actually. That's really important. So let's move to the Holodomor, 1933. Up to 7 million Ukrainians died because of the man-made famine. And of course, the number is huge. But to make some comparison, you can imagine that 6 million Jewish people were killed during the World War II. So the number is actually pretty high. So the idea of Stalin's idea was to be the largest manufacturer actually of grain. And why in Ukraine? Because the land is so fruitful. And it's called the breadbasket of Europe. But the forced collectivization that was not the best solution. The private farms were gathered together for the joint enterprises, but the effectiveness was very low. Why? Because the Stalins, of course, what he did, he got rid of the experienced and well-educated farmers. So those people who stayed there, they were not able, or they didn't have experience how to manage such huge land. So that's why the effectiveness was very low. And the demand for the grain was extremely high. So people, they didn't have enough food to survive.
So yes, one thing that's very common among communists is that they will use supply chain, willing incompetence of the government to subjugate a people. And we see this in the Holodomor, where millions of people died because Stalin deliberately withheld grain shipments, in addition to the other atrocities of forcing people and creating a sense that the kulaks, the successful farmers, were somehow entitled or privileged, and they deserved to die because they were exploiting the people. Where in reality, it was a war against meritocracy itself to demoralize the Ukrainian people. A battle that's still being played out right now in the modern war in Ukraine. Here is a picture of some of the hundreds of priests and religious who were killed as a result of the Holodomor. Many were targeted specifically because the communist government saw the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church as a threat. So they were the main target of many of the killings when we're talking about the actual actions of the secret police, particularly the Cheka, during the Holodomor.
So cutting forest, that's an example of how they got rid of the intelligentsia from my country, from Poland. So in 1939, when the Soviets invade, of course, right after the Germans invade Poland, they captured well-educated and high-rank soldiers, and they killed them actually in the Katyn forest in 1940. And what is important here, there was no trial, just the signature of Stalin. And in my country, up to 1990, we were taught in schools that German killed the Polish people there in Katyn. Of course, right after World War II, especially in my area, many Russian teachers came to taught us the true history, right? So
The true history.
Exactly. And I would like to point out here also important fact that in 2010, in April, actually our government flew there to Katyn because there was 70 years after this event, but the plane crashed. and 96 people died, mainly politicians and also our president Lech Kaczynski back then. Well, the official says that there was a delay, 30 minutes, so we should land the plane there. So the pilot was actually forced, and because there was a fog, so the wing cut off the trees, and it made the failure of the structure. But we don't know what happened there actually, because we cannot get the plane. They keep
the black box, yes.
Everything. They keep everything in Russia. Of course, we did some investigation. There are many speculations because the fog might have been artificial, or there might be a bomb on the plane. But we don't know that, and because we cannot get the parts of the airplane.
There's a reason, essentially. Yeah. So the Russians may have assassinated the Polish president in 2010, and they're hiding it. Ironically, a trip back from a commemoration from this event. So it's symbolic, and it just doesn't add up. So I want to tell you about perhaps one of the most well-known or most important heroes in Polish World War II history. Witold Pilecki is the only known volunteer to enter Auschwitz from the Polish underground. He was one of the leaders of the Polish underground movement, where essentially there were two governments, a government in exile in Moscow and a government in exile in London. He was part of the London group, and he willingly volunteered to enter Auschwitz twice. He basically went in, got intelligence on the Germans, and published the first report we have about the Holocaust. That was promptly ignored by our government because it didn't think it was true. So Witold not only went in the first time, but to really hammer in the point, he went in twice and got out again. He knew how to run an underground movement. He helped with the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He helped with the resistance in Auschwitz. He is perhaps one of the most important figures when we're talking about all kinds of resistance efforts in World War II. He has this quote, "I have lived my life in such a way that when I meet death, I will be happy instead of afraid." However, even a war hero like this could not survive the communists. What had happened after World War II is that the communists took over. He originally fought the communists in 1920 when they attempted to invade for the first time. And then after World War II, when they invaded for the second, he was still part of the Polish underground. He coordinated attacks for the first few years of the Soviet occupation, and then they eventually figured him out. And they were initially hesitant to execute the first and most important national war hero of Poland, but they did anyway. They had a trumped-up trial, which is something very common, where essentially they had televised all kinds of lies and blackmail through torture to make this man, this war hero of the Polish people, lie on the sand to save his family. Ultimately, he was killed by the Soviets because of what he represented to the Polish people. Is that fundamentally from the very beginning there were groups that were armed and ready to do violent rebellion against the Russians as they invaded, but they were disorganized and they needed help to be put together. This right here is a picture of the Gulag Archipelago. It is 140 camps all around Russia, which is 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. Some of the deadliest camps over here by the Kamchatka boast death counts larger than Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen combined. People don't know about this. Millions of Poles, any dissident Russian. The idea behind communism holding their power is that they would do purges. People who are even loyal to the party may find themselves on a list and sent by train to one of these camps in Siberia. And there are 140 of them. How we figured it out was another man, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He had two stories that I want to share with you when it comes to how this could even happen and us not know about it. His first quote that I'll say is that the line between good and evil goes through every human heart. Is that there is so much complicity in all of these camps, where so many people did things that they knew to be wrong in their heart, yet through fear and sometimes greed, they did them anyway. So his lesson to us all And Eliza mentioned it earlier, as he had this quote, "Live not by lies. Do not do what you know to be true in your heart according to your conscience. Protect freedom of conscience."
So we do know that they still operate. They just changed the name, like in case of KGB. So now it's the corrective colony. Some of you probably know the story of Alexei Navalny. So he was a politician, he was the opponent of Putin, and also a founder of the anti-corruption foundation. He was poisoned and hospitalized in Germany, in Berlin. After the hospitalization, he was enough brave to go back to Moscow, to Russia, and fight against communists. Of course, he crossed the border, he was captured and sent to the Arctic Circle, to the corrective colony. And this year in February, we got the information from the corrective colony that he is dead. We don't know what it happened actually, but the thing is that the poison that they use, the FSB now, it's we don't know the chemical composition of it, and it's untraceable. So yeah, as we can see, still they operate the same way like it was in the past. They eliminate the opponents in general.
So this is Walter Zizek. So he has an American name almost. He's actually born in America to Polish parents. When he was 12, he joined a gang in Philadelphia. This man was tough as nails. He did all kinds of crimes until his 20s, where he had a conversion experience and decided to become a Jesuit priest. And because of his background, being able to speak Russian and Polish fluently, he had to go back to that area of Europe to evangelize after World War II because there was so much devastation and destruction. However, much like Navalny, when he went over to the region, he was betrayed and he was arrested on suspicion of being a Vatican spy. So he was immediately sent to a gulag in Kamchatka, one of the deadliest gulags, and he spent 15 years in captivity. And during that time, he had this experience that I just want to share with you right now, is that, every day he would be forced to work for somewhere 16 hours a day or plus in the freezing cold. Yet, during his lunch break, he would often skip breakfast so that he can carry enough bread together to celebrate Mass. And eventually, they figured him out as they thought he was important. He wasn't actually that important at the time. And they put him in the worst prison still operated today in Moscow, Lubyanka. That right there is a statue of Iron Felix. He is the founder of the Chekhov, the FSB, the KGB. We'll just call it whatever the Russian secret police is during the time. And this is the building they operate out of currently still today. And at the time, essentially, you'd have hundreds of political prisoners that were all being executed at the bottom in the basement of this area by the Chekhov. He spent 5 years in this prison, and he was tortured in unimaginable ways for his faith. He was forced to blackmail the Pope and whatever. Basically, they thought he knew all the cardinals where he didn't, which is interesting because they just did it in this case for the sake of doing it. And even as he was being tortured, he kept bread underneath his fingernails so that in between torture sessions, he could consecrate it and have Mass. He still had Mass every single day, despite being in these conditions in this camp. What's really amazing about Walter Zizek is that eventually he was able to escape. So he was part of a Jesuit order out of New York at the time, and they thought he had died. And perhaps in one of the happier moments of this talk, he came back to life. For 30 years, or not 30 years, 15 years, they thought he was dead. And essentially, we're like, I'm back now. I was doing all these things. So he was immediately taken back, and he wrote several books and everything like that, and then he became a professor of theology at Fordham for the rest of his life, where he told the story of what he went through. And one thing he told me that really stuck is that, if you want to survive this kind of horrible treatment in the worst prisons in the world, you have to let go and let God, essentially. You have to not be childish, but be childlike in your understanding and your hope for civilization and things getting better. You have to hold on to that hope. If you don't have that hope, you die. It's simple as that. And that's how Zizek managed to move forward through that, and now he's a servant of God. So those of you who aren't familiar with the canonization process, that is the first step to being canonized.
Okay, so now let's move to the question how to resist a communist regime. And I would like to point a history from my city, from Wrocław actually. There was a local movement called Orange Alternative, and then actually in 80s made fun of the government. So what they did, they paint the graffiti with the slogans against the communists. So the communists, they just paint out this. So they paint again the dwarfs on the walls. So the people, they were aware that there was something against the politicians against the communists. And in 2001, the dwarf became the symbol of my city, the symbol of liberty, actually. So there are like more than 1,000 dwarfs around. And that's one of them. That's an example. So we have here 5 terms: spreading through, life not by lies, strong social bonds, nonviolent civil disobedience, and rebellion. So those terms are associated with the how to resist, and we have some examples how it was done in the reality actually back then in 70s and 80s. So now we need to go back actually. So right after World War II, the Cold War, Berlin airlift. So there was a tension between US and the Soviets, and Stalin shut down the electricity and water in Berlin. Berlin was divided into west part and the east. East was under the occupation of Soviets as well as the east side of Germany. So, and the west part was operated by US. So to provide enough food, there was just the one route from the West Germany to the West Berlin. So they also closed this route. So Truman faced the challenge how to provide enough food and for the people there. So the idea was to send the airplanes. So he sent like quite a lot, and people were able to survive. Why Stalin did that? Because the communists, they lose the election. So for mayor of the city, and also the west side wanted to issue own currency, and they did that. And at that day, the Soviets shut down the electricity and water, and that was actually, I would say, the first small victory of the democracy against the communists. And I have one story. So in Poland, we also got many packages from the West Germany and from Western countries. And because, like in our country, there was basically nothing in the shop. So people sometimes they didn't know what they got. So, for instance, when like my relatives, when they got a kiwi, they thought that it's a potato. It's a different one. So yeah. Now it sounds funny, but back then, yeah.
Yeah, if you can't read that, it says milk, the new weapon of democracy. It kind of seems stupid when you think about it, but things were so crazy like that in terms of the economy that people were denied all sorts of things. I'll talk a similar situation my mom went through. Essentially, because things were being moved through, there were Western aid being sent through the churches. So the Catholic Church was one of the main sources by which you can get access to Western food, Western medicine. Essentially, because all those were limited underneath the communist government where there were frequent shortages. And essentially, the church was the focal point of aid. And for my mom's confirmation, she, for the first time, had potato chips. Think about this for a second. There are millions of potatoes, even during a famine, being grown in Poland. Yet the idea of a potato chip factory did not happen until the Berlin Wall fell. So that's kind of interesting. It's not like the Holodomor happening in one of the most fertile areas of the world. It's like, how do you get it this backwards? Or essentially, my mom saw cheddar cheese for the first time from one of these things as well. Is that fundamentally, yes, everyone in protest. These are freedom chips, by the way. And essentially, the idea is that the church was the main avenue, in many ways, for people to see something, that there's something beyond what they're going through now. And this has been a theme in anti-communist resistance, is that you just show people that there's a better life out there if only you fight this oppression. You might even get potato chips. So, back to Hungary. So this is the Venerable. Venerable is, it goes servant of God, blessed, venerable, then saint, by the way. So, Venerable Joseph Mindszenty, the exile. So this man also had a hard life. Essentially, when the Nazis invaded Hungary, he was imprisoned. And when the Soviets liberated Hungary, he was also imprisoned. He was put in a prison in Budapest, where he would be moved around from cell to cell every night as a psychological torture. He wrote extensively about his time there. And for a period of time, he was prevented from celebrating Mass. And as a priest, that is perhaps one of the hardest things to go without. So it is purported that a bearded man appeared in one of his prison cells. You don't necessarily have to believe this. Saint Padre Pio himself is purported to have bilocated to his prison cell. And it's, regardless of whether you believe in bilocation, this man's faith was enormous because he was the voice of the Hungarian people while they were suffering immensely. He wrote very much about why the church, even underneath this oppression, should stand up. Do you want a church that remains silent when she should speak? That diminishes the law of God where she was called upon it to claim it loudly? Wanting to accommodate the will of man? Do you want a church that departs from the unshakable foundations upon which Christ founded her? Taking the easy way out of adapting herself to the opinions of the day? A church that is prey to the current trends? A church that does not condemn the suppression of conscience and allows the suppression of conscience and does not stand for the just liberty of the people? A church that locks herself within her four walls of temple in unseeming sycophancy, forgetting the divine mission received from Christ. Go out to the crossroads and preach to the people. Beloved sons and daughters, spiritual heirs to the numberless confessors and martyrs, is this a church you venerate and love? Would you recognize such a church in the features of your mother? Would you be able to imagine the successor of St. Peter submitting to such demands? Cardinal Mindszenty was very critical of the capitulations to the communist government on account of the Vatican. So he got it from both sides, essentially. He was one of the lone voices that was able to stand up in Hungary against all forms of repression from the Nazis and the Soviets. And he was the one kernel of hope that was snuffed out. However, he helped inspire the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. This is the first couple of months where a country in the Eastern Soviet bloc was able to have a few months of democracy. Primarily, they used violence, though. They would have summary lynchings of secret police officers as reprisals. So, as far as violence and killing and taking over radio stations and forcing themselves into power, brought down the ire of the Soviet Union, where they sent an invasion force from a dozen countries to quell what was going on in Budapest, where thousands died as a result of this failed attempt to create a democracy in the Eastern Bloc. That at the time, the Soviets, Stalin was about to die, but as far as at the time, the Soviets were ready to use violence in any means necessary to stamp out any dissension. However, the fortunate thing about this is that Cardinal Mindszenty managed to escape across the street from his prison to the American embassy, where he spent out the rest of his days being able to at least speak freely, knowing that if he ever stepped outside of the walls of the embassy, he would be killed. So for the rest of his life, he was able to be that voice that people needed in Hungary. And, that's just kind of what's really led to the next major revolt, very similar to the 1956 revolution. I've been to this place. It's Prague, the Prague Spring of 1968. And a very similar thing happened. It was a violent revolution where there was nonviolent, it was more nonviolent, but still, the Soviets sent in the tanks. The protesters and people in the underground did not have the means or the support from the West necessary to fight back against this. Also during the Prague Spring in 1968, there were similar results in Poland, student protests. At the time, my grandfather, the son of my great-grandfather, he was a university student. This was his first protest against communism. You see, my great-grandfather was a staunch pro-communist and a leader at the time. But his son married a woman who had a different idea. Essentially, my grandparents were solidarity members from the very beginning, doing all kinds of things that people from born in that time would do, the equivalent of Polish shakers. And what that would lead to is a few things. So, two very important characters in the Prague Spring were Václav Havel and Václav Benda. Václav Havel later became president of the Czech Republic, but before, he was a playwright, and he wrote this essay that sticks with me today. It's called Power to the Powerless, and it describes a greengrocer. Now, a greengrocer in communist Czechoslovakia had to have a sign that said, "I am loyal to the party, I am beyond reproach, I have earned the right to be left alone by the secret police." And next to it, they had to have signs showing all kinds of abundance. And there was nothing in the stores, but the propaganda would say there are plenty in the stores. This kind of Potemkinization of what was available to people. For example, when my grandparents and my mom were growing up, you could only have bananas once a year on Christmas. And they would be a little brown like this one because they came from Cuba. But think about that. Bananas nowadays are the easiest produce item to ship anywhere in the world. Yet bananas were a commodity, a luxury. People would line around the block to go to the greengrocer and have bananas. I know, it's bananas. And, yeah. Yes, essentially, so the essay Power to the Powerless talks about what happens to a Czech greengrocer if they simply just take down the sign. Quit lying to people. Act by what you know to be true. And of course, that is considered simply telling the truth is perhaps one of the boldest statements of resistance in a regime like this. Simply stop lying to people. Stop doing what you know not to be true and stand by your conscience. There were no bananas in the store. Stop putting pictures of bananas everywhere. And another person, his name is Václav Benda. He was a Catholic, a family man, and he led something called the Parallel Polis. It was, an interesting idea is that we're in a room right now talking about important subversive things in some governments. His idea was to do that as often as possible, to print samizdat, to create a safe space, so to speak, that's the charged language, where people can be dissidents, essentially be able to discuss free ideas, discuss the Bible, biblical groups. The Catholic Church could spread their ideas in the Bible, and where seminary students can learn how to become priests, creating a little island of freedom in an ocean of oppression and lies. That was the work of Václav Benda in Prague, which earned him many stints in prison. But he did a simple thing. He was a family man who just opened his home and had conversations. And it was simple. And that's just the idea here, is that little acts of resistance, they add up. Everyday people are capable of them.
So, Radio Free Europe, that is the idea founded by, actually here in the States, by government and by CAA. And that was the only source of reliable information in East Europe. Because it was it was not controlled by the Soviets, of course. So, at the beginning, it was placed in New York City, but because it's a little far away from Europe, so they moved to Munich. And that was the way of the communication for many leaders that were against the communists to spread the information in the society. And they used the immigrants from the East Europe that broadcasted the information. And as far as I remember, I guess it was every Sunday. So it was like the holiday. Of course, Sunday is a holiday, but it's like a double one. So like the entire household needed to be quiet because like the parents, grandparents, they were listening to this radio. So yeah, and that's an example how we were able to access, thanks to radio, to the information out of the country, and also what was really going on in our country. Because the media provided by government, by communists, the statistics, everything was a lie.
So to bounce back to the future a little bit, there was a point in Polish history where anti-communism was under the darkest hour. And there were people there attempting to create a version of Radio Free Europe, of Radio Free Poland. A couple, not much older than you or me. Essentially, they had an idea of creating a resistance force of everyday young people in Warsaw to help spread the news through radio. So what you would do is that you would approach a church, this couple, and you have to give them a key to your house, and they might hide a transponder somewhere in the city. The idea is it had to be secret, it had to be distributed, and basically the Soviets had two different technologies. They could jam the signal, or they can trace the signal, so like triangulation. So they had to be super strategic about where they hid the transponders, because it's a little more complicated than running a podcast. Essentially, they had to hide this analog bastion of resistance all over Warsaw, and they couldn't at any given time know how many people were listening. So, because there wasn't any rating system or anything like that, they weren't really syndicated. And essentially, it was a dark hour, because at any given moment, any one of the nodes could be captured through the tracking system, or then most of the time it was jammed because they knew how to jam the frequencies, the Soviets. So there was this one night where it was especially hopeless, where they thought that no one was listening, there's no one out there, the Soviets jammed us, they're going to trace us in a second, we don't know. So one of the people running the radio station had this idea, is that if you are in earshot of this radio broadcast, blink your lights. So what we see is that they look outside and they see the entire city of Warsaw for hours blinking their lights. Because in the moment when they thought no one was listening, God was listening, and that means everyone was listening. So the prophetic words from W.H. Auden that wrote about the Polish people during the beginning of World War II became true. I have but one tongue to undo the folded lie. The lie in the brain of the central man on the street, the lie of authority whose buildings broke the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice for the citizen or the police. We must love one another, or we will die. Defenseless into the night, our world in stupor lies. And yet, dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, like them, composed of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. The idea is, this is written in the Gospels, is that you are the light of the world. Let your light shine before all, that they may see the good that you do and give glory to God. That is powerful. It's a powerful story about how everyday people risk their lives. Because if you were listening to the radio, you could get arrested, get disappeared, never see your family again. But everyone took that risk because it was important to hear the truth.
So, the head of our church in Poland, blessed Stefan Wyszyński, he was a very important person after the World War II, because he was a strong conservative cardinal, and he negotiated with the communists. Basically, he wanted to, he fought for religion at the schools, and also the permission for opening the Christian university in Poland. And important fact about him, he was the initiator of the pastoral letter of Polish bishops to German brothers. So we forgive and we are asking for forgiveness. It was in 1965, so 20 years after World War II, we were asking for and we forgave for World War II. So, yeah, and he also played a crucial role in choosing Saint JP2 for Pope in 1978.
St. John Paul II, the patron of the Wojtyla Institute, came to Poland at a time where it was fraught, where essentially there was a lack of hope. You know, after decades and decades of oppression, there was no path forward that they can see because they had, in 56, been crushed by the tanks, and in 68, also crushed. So what is the path forward? So when a Polish pope was elected to the pontificate, there was hope. When he landed and kissed the ground at the Warsaw airport, he did something miraculous, so to speak. For decades and decades, there was a God-shaped hole imprinted through the schools and through propagandas in the heart of every Central and Eastern European. They were not allowed to learn about God. God was dead. And here comes the pontiff, the bridge to God. And he came in and he brought hope to the Polish people. Because if a Pole can be on the throne of St. Peter, anything is possible. He came to the country and he says, freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want. Rather, freedom is the ability to live responsibly, the truth of our relationship and with one another and St. JP2. And there were two words on the lips of every Polish person in that square. Chcemy Boga. We want God. Because it was... Chcemy. My matko. Chcemy. And this idea of a continent rising up to hear a homily from a pope in Poland, recognizing the 1,000-year anniversary of the initial Catholicism of Poland, the Christianization of Poland, it changed everything. It inspired people that maybe one day, very soon, they can gather in ways that the communists could not fight against.
Gdańsk shipyard, so 1970, and what happens there moves the war. That's what I actually found in internet, and it's true because that was the beginning of very strong movement in Poland towards the freedom, democracy. What happened? In 1970, our communist government increased the prices for food up to 30%. And for people, their salaries were low, so they were not able to afford food. So what's the point of working, right? So the strikes began at the north part of our country, near to the Baltic Sea, at the shipyards. And that's an example of how the communists operated back then, because they just killed the people. They opened the fire to stop the strikes at the shipyards, and in December 1970, almost 45 people were killed. Because army opened the fire to regular people who were at the work. Of course, they were striking, but that's also an example of the labor union that was created. So together we have the power to resist the communists, and they were actually also demanding the better salaries and the better work environment.
Let's think about how this started for a second. It was a group of workers who wanted to collectively bargain with their bosses for better working conditions and to be able to fight for some kind of dignity in their work. It's beginning to end in the same way, too.
So the other important person is bless Jerzy Popiełuszko. So he was the chaplain of the Solidarity movement. And he was directly involved in helping people, the members of the Solidarity. What was his job? So he encouraged people for peacefully and non-violently resist the communism. He used Radio Free Europe to do that, and also at the church. So his homilies always motivate people to fight, of course, non-violently, peacefully against the communists. And he was actually captured by communists because, he didn't want to cooperate with them. So.
Yes. So what led this is perhaps something we're familiar with in the United States, which is police brutality. Essentially, he led one of the depot points in which Western medicine, there was a huge shortage of antibiotics, came into Warsaw. And the secret police hated him for it. One of his secretaries, Barbara Słodowska, was leading this, particularly sending in medicine to people who needed it, and they wanted to get at her. So what is common among many, all communist regimes, is that they would exert pressure on people's families. So they found Słodowska's son, Grzegorz Przemek, on the day of his graduation from high school. In the middle of the town square, the secret police beat him to death and then pinned the murder, the lynching, on his ambulance driver. The official narrative was that the ambulance driver killed a boy for no reason. A boy that just so happened to be the son of one of the leaders of the smuggling ring led by the church. And, of course, he was a parishioner at Jerzy Popiełuszko's church, so for his funeral, they decided to have a silent protest. So thousands of people came together, carrying the casket from the church to the graveyard, silent for a mile. And the Holy Father said that their silence was louder than 1,000 screams. The idea is that, older regimes would try to take reprisals on the secret police. In 1968 and 56, that probably would have happened. But this one was silent. This one was after Martin Luther King Jr. This one was after, essentially, where people knew the effectiveness of nonviolence. They were going to fight back using the same terms of nonviolence that worked for Gandhi and MLK and any other places. However, the secret police eventually, as Szymon mentioned, found him too. He had his last homily in a place called Bydgoszcz, where my great-grandfather was a leading communist official. And in Bydgoszcz, he saved his last homily in a church called the Church of the Martyrs. And he said this: Christians are obliged to stand by the truth, even if it is costly. This is from his last homily. And essentially, he left for Poland afterward. He left for Warsaw afterwards in a car. The secret police came to him in the middle of the night, and they beat him to death and threw his body in the river, and it wasn't discovered for another 10 days. And, it's interesting, actually. I am always haunted by the fact that my great-grandfather may have known some of the people who were involved. Is that because, it was a small world when you were in the communist government at the time, where essentially everybody talked, everybody knew each other, and, that's something that I'm probably never going to get to know, essentially. And essentially, from that moment forward, something changed. Something that never happened before in any Soviet state is that the 3 secret police officers that were responsible for his death were found and prosecuted. For the first time in communist history, secret police faced trial in, albeit a kangaroo court, for their crimes. And they were all convicted and given slaps on the wrist settlements and let out later. But essentially, this was the first time that someone in the government was held accountable for something they did. After the communists killed over 60 million to 100 million people, this was the first time that somebody got punished for what they did. And that's what changed everything. That justice in this new world of solidarity was possible.
So So the leader of the Solidarity, Lech Wałęsa. So he was the electrician at the shipyard of the name of Lenin, but because he was against the communists, he was fired from the shipyard. But in 1980, when the strikes began there, he jumped over the fence and joined people inside. And at that time, he became the leader of the Solidarity, and he was able actually to make this, let's say, movement or party official. So the Solidarity was recognized by the government and was official working at our country. Unfortunately, it lasted just 1 year.
And here is a newspaper from that year, printed on an illegal printing press, illegal to own, kind of powerful in my hand when you think about it, discussing his first couple of addresses to the government in the first semi-free political labor union, any kind of organization officially recognized by the communists. So you can see this after the tour. It's very powerful. Simon and I can have you read.
So it was from September 1981, September. And in December, martial law was declared by the General Jaruzelski. And that was a very difficult time for our country because the borders were closed, the curfew, and also the general propaganda. And the hope that we had for a freedom was actually a bit decreased during this time. Finally, it was suspended in 1983 because of the pilgrimage of Saint JP to Poland. So the communists, they wanted to use it as to show off that our country it's supposed in a good condition, because the Jaruzelski idea was to prevent the intervention from the Soviet Union. There were strikes in Poland in the 80s, so they were expecting that maybe the Soviet army will enter to help the government to shut down the strikes. But of course, it's not true. They were scared that they will be not able to keep the power and rule the country.
During this time, almost every major Solidarity leader was imprisoned. What's different here is that the Soviets didn't invade, and the major leaders of Solidarity weren't immediately all killed. Lech Wałęsa had even got the Nobel Peace Prize while he was in prison at this time, and his wife had to go over to Stockholm for the acceptance speech. So that's something that's really powerful. But the problem is that, essentially it nearly cost the life of Pope St. John Paul II. So there's it's another one of those assassination things where you can put on your tinfoil hats and believe all kinds of things. But essentially, the actions of Aliaka over here nearly killing Pope John Paul II in accordance with the third prophecy of Fatima. If you're not familiar with what happened in Fatima, essentially the third prophecy foresees the killing of the Pope. And what had happened here, one of three things. First, the CIA believed that this was reprisal for the Solidarity movement. Essentially, throughout all this time, the CIA and the Vatican Bank were funding the movement, and they were the two legs upon which the Solidarity movement received most of its funding. So they wanted to put an end to it by striking the Pope into the fear of 1.2 billion Catholics worldwide. Another is that simply it wasn't the Soviets. They empowered local mob bosses in Italy, and they got Turkish Aliaka to do it. A third one is that simply a right-wing crazy guy basically decided to shoot the Pope one day. So I encourage you to do your own research into this, but the facts point towards the reprisal for his actions in the Solidarity movement.
All right, so the turning point in our history after almost 45 years, the round table talks began. It was in 1989. So all politician parties, including the Solidarity, they gathered together and spoke about the new order in my country. So Lech Wałęsa was there, and also in 1989, Lech Wałęsa was the third actually person at the U.S. Congress giving a speech there. So yeah, that for us it's a very important point of the history, because after that we have democracy in Poland, and Lech Wałęsa was the first president elected in a free election in 1990.
So yes, he gave an amazing speech. He was the third non-state head to ever give a full address to Congress, where he talked about the importance of American values. He cited the Declaration of Independence as an inspiration for him, saying that ultimately the power is from we the people, and we the people is solidarity. Solidarity between all kinds of people. And this particular model of resistance spread all over the Eastern Bloc, to the point where we go back to where it all began in Berlin. Yes, Mr. Gorbachev, this wall, tear down this wall. Essentially, this happened all by accident and everything like that. They didn't expect on the day when they tore down the wall to tear down the wall. It was a miscommunication from a communist official. Happens all the time. And everybody interpreted it as, let's just tear the wall down. There was this idea, celebration, orchestras were played all around the Brandenburg Gate. Everywhere the wall was, there were people hammering at it. Because today was the day that the Eastern Bloc ended. So in Germany, they tore down the wall. In Poland, they had free elections. In the Czech Republic, they had the Velvet Revolution. In Estonia and in Latvia and Lithuania, they had a Cuban chain going from one end to the other end to celebrate the end. Hands across Lithuania, basically. All over the world, all over the region, country by country, slowly started getting more and more freedoms, with a few exceptions like Transnistria and Belarus. But many places received democracy and freedom for the first time, perhaps in Poland's case, in centuries. A sustainable democracy and freedom, that is. Until finally, in 1991, at St. Peter's Square, essentially, there was a fight between the local resistance movement and the police. And for the first time, during one of those riot demonstrations, the police joined the protesters. And that is how communism fell in Russia. There was no more need for the Soviet Union because no one believed it anymore. It was vacant. However, it's not the same thing that happened 35 years ago this week in China. At the same time that Poland was getting its first democracy, millions of people in China had survived. Perhaps it was the worst genocide in terms of numbers. It was a great leap forward. Over 100 million killed. And mostly focusing on intellectuals and people through starvation, all kinds of things. Imagine what was going on in Europe times 4, practically. And basically, the Solidarity movement figured out ways that they could help people even in China. So Pope John Paul II collaborated with the Dalai Lama to help aid in a lot of underground resistance that is later coming to light. But I'm sure you're familiar with this picture. This is the Tank Man. 35 years ago, yesterday, he stood in front of those tanks, one guy versus a line of tanks, knowing that he would probably be killed for doing this. It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of conscience to be that man. And we don't know who this man is because, it's all being suppressed. But in many ways, that man could be you or me. That's our responsibility, is that when we see that, we need to be the kinds of person who stands in front of the tanks, rather than the ones who capitulates. So more people like that is that we talk about a future saint. He's still alive. Cardinal Joseph Zen. So if you're familiar with what is going on in Hong Kong right now, for about 100 years, Hong Kong in China enjoyed more freedoms. They were spared the killings of many places in the communist bloc and in China. So they enjoyed, and many of these people grew up understanding democracy. Yet in 2014, the lease expiration expired, and China sought to take back Hong Kong for itself. So, similar to the Solidarity Movement, a group of Christians and Catholics and secular people got together and they created the Umbrella Revolution in 2014 that lasted all the way till 2019, where ordinary people took to the streets, singing hymns, staring down the communist forces, going around, beating people, disappearing people. They were never seen again in many cases. A lot of the things you hear about the Chinese government, for example, the Uyghur Muslims that are being forced to pick cotton in concentration camps, as if we learned nothing from our last history, is still going on today. And corporations all over the United States, like Disney, they're complicit in it. They're working with it for an economic gain. But one person stood against that, to push against that. That was Cardinal Joseph Zen. He's still alive, barely, because they're waiting for him. He's the cardinal over in Hong Kong, and he was imprisoned 2 years ago for his involvement with the movement. Is that today solidarity is alive and well in Hong Kong? Is that people are fighting back? Unfortunately, as of this week, the Hong Kong 47 of these leaders are all convicted of sedition under a new law, which means that they will see prison times in many of the same camps that people suffered during the Great Leap Forward. They need our prayers. And another thing that's really important is that this week, I just thought this a little bit amusing and everything like that. One thing that's going on in North Korea and South Korea that is phenomenal is that they are putting K-pop, Bible verses, and all kinds of things in USB sticks. You can donate your USB sticks, and they overwrite it with all kinds of propaganda, the equivalent of potato chips, the digital equivalent of potato chips, and then mass sending them via balloons over the demilitarized zone in North Korea to give the North Koreans a taste of freedom in the same way that was going on with Radio Free Europe and the Western aid packages. Because this is the most surefire way to change things. And it's working because the North Koreans are sending balloons back full of trash. Is that ultimately, there's just so much going on with global terrorism and everything like that. Raise your hand here if you learned something new today. Exactly. The idea, my mom didn't, but the idea is that, when it comes to the World War II, it's been 80 years since the landing in Normandy this week. So more and more of the people who were there, who saw it on television, who were, aware of it, they're dying out. And what that means is that history will inevitably repeat itself, regardless of what we do. And the people who lived through it are no longer there to help us through what went wrong. So that is why it is so important that we gather in rooms, and we talk and say seditious things, and we basically have this idea of solidarity. People fear that the solidarity movement can never happen again in Poland because kids these days are atomized. It turns out the powers that be realized that this phone right here was the best way to oppress anyone than they ever could think of, simply because Poland was able to do it because people had community. People came together in rooms and in churches, secular people, religious people, different minorities, people of all statuses. They gathered in third places, and they planned, and they plotted, and they fought, and they believed together. And that's what's so powerful about the Wojtyla Institute, is that we are currently doing that today, right now. And I want you to take that with you.